What does the richest person you know do for living? Story 1. There was a guy in my town who owned a string of parking lots, and he used to joke that he made his fortune one bad parallel park at a time. I worked at one of his lots during college, and the guy had the setup of dreams. A payment machine that did all the work, one grumpy attendant who did none of the work, and a lot so full of potholes you could call it the crater zone. When I asked him why he didn't fix the lot, he said, "If I fix it, people will expect more. You keep the bar low and no one complains." And somehow he wasn't wrong. Story 2. Our mailman, Tom, used to show up like clockwork, but what really shocked us was learning he owned 20 rental properties. When I asked him how he managed to afford all that on a mailman's salary, he just winked and said, "Mail's not my only delivery." Turns out he got his start flipping houses, but instead of selling them, he just kept renting them out. He still drove the same rusty van from the 80s and insisted it was all part of the disguise. "No one bothers you for money if they think you're broke," he'd say while circling new property listings in the classifieds during his lunch break. Story 3. The richest person I know is a guy who sells cardboard boxes. Yep, just boxes. I asked him once how he got so rich, and he said, "Turns out, people love putting things in boxes. I'm just here to supply the obsession." He's got a factory somewhere churning out packing supplies 24/7, but you'd never guess it by looking at him. He dresses like a dad on vacation and drives an old Honda Civic. One time someone asked why he didn't drive something fancier, and he said, "This is my Ferrari, if you squint and believe in miracles." Story 4. I used to think car washes were just boring little businesses until I met my buddy's dad, who owned a chain of them. This man was living the dream, barely working, raking in cash, and claiming the only thing he had to do was occasionally restock the soap. He once told me, "The secret to success is getting people to pay you to do what the rain could do for free." When I asked him why he didn't retire, he said, "What else am I going to do? Golf? I don't even like the sun." Story 5. My uncle had a friend who won $45 million in the lottery. And you know what he did? He kept working as a mechanic. I asked why, and he said, "Because nobody expects the guy under their car to be a millionaire." It's hilarious. He'd still charge people for oil changes, and then tip them $100 when they weren't looking. His big splurge? A gold-plated wrench. When I asked him if it actually worked, he said, "Who cares? It's shiny." Story 6. When I was a kid, there was this guy in our town who owned parking lots. Sounds random, right? But as I got older, I realized just how much of a genius he was. He started small, buying a rundown parking lot near the downtown area when no one else saw potential in it. He threw in a couple of basic upgrades, a new payment machine and a few lights that barely worked. Then he hired one attendant who spent most of his shift scrolling on his phone. That was it, and every weekend the lot was packed. Over time, he bought more lots around the city, each more low maintenance than the last. I once asked him why he didn't sell his lots to developers when the market was booming, and he just laughed and said, "Why give up a cash printer?" I remember one day, he casually mentioned property taxes being a killer, but he was smart enough to keep his overhead low. He didn't even own a fancy car or a huge house. He lived like an average Joe. But behind that low-key exterior, he was raking it in. The last time I saw him, he was helping an elderly woman figure out the toll machine at one of his lots. I always admired how he made something so mundane into a gold mine. Story 7. The richest person I've ever met was, unbelievably, my old mailman, Jim. He delivered letters in my neighborhood for over 30 years, always with a smile and a pocket full of advice. One day, as a teenager, I asked him how he always seemed so content. He grinned and said, "Kid, just buy real estate." Turns out in the 70s, while on his route, he befriended a few retired golfers who tipped him off to the value of real estate investing. Jim saved every penny he could and started buying properties one at a time, mostly small houses or duplexes near his route. By the time I was old enough to understand what he'd done, he owned 15 or so properties, all paid off, each generating steady income. Jim still drove his old beat-up car, wore his USPS uniform, and insisted he'd never quit his job because he didn't want to lose out on his pension. When I asked why he didn't live it up, he said, "Happiness isn't in the spending, it's in the freedom." He retired on schedule, and the last I heard, he'd moved to a beautiful mountain estate. I still remember the classified ads he carried with him, always circling his next investment. Story 8. I never thought much of the car wash business until I met the father of one of my high school friends. This guy owned a string of car washes all over town, and it was like owning a money printing machine. Every weekend, his car washes were slammed with cars, each one dropping a few bucks for a quick rinse. What blew my mind was how hands-off it all was. He barely visited any of the locations. Everything was automated, and the managers he hired handled the day-to-day. I found out later that he didn't even care about the car washes themselves. He saw them as placeholders for valuable land. A few of the locations were eventually flipped for millions to real estate developers. His house was modest for someone with that kind of money, but I noticed little hints, like the brand-new truck he drove and the extravagant vacations his family took. I asked him once how he got started, and he said, "I just looked for a business that was simple, predictable, and had low overhead. The rest took care of itself." Now, every time I see a car wash, I can't help but wonder if it's secretly owned by someone like him. Story 9. There was this guy in my uncle's circle who hit it big in the lottery, something like $45 million back in the late 90s. I met him a few times at family events, and you'd never guess he was loaded. He still wore the same cheap sneakers and jeans he probably owned before winning. According to my uncle, he didn't even quit his day job right away. Instead, he hired financial advisors to help him invest the bulk of his winnings. Over time, he quietly built up a real estate empire, buying apartments and commercial properties across the state. The guy stayed out of the spotlight and avoided flashy purchases, which is probably why he still has most of his money. One thing I remember vividly is how calm he seemed compared to other people with way less money. My uncle told me that he once asked the guy why he didn't live it up more, and his answer was, "The money's great, but the peace of mind is better." That stuck with me. Story 10. I once worked for a contractor who was the epitome of quiet wealth. This guy, let's call him Mike, ran a mid-sized construction company that built custom homes and commercial buildings. On the surface, he seemed like any other guy in the business, jeans, boots, and a work truck with a toolbox in the back. But once you got to know him, you realized he was in a league of his own. Mike never advertised his business. Everything was word of mouth, and his reputation alone kept him booked solid for years. He didn't just build, he owned. Nearly every project he took on included a deal where he'd keep a stake in the property, and over time he amassed a portfolio of commercial spaces, apartment complexes, and even a couple of warehouses. He never flaunted his money, but you could see the signs: fishing trips to Alaska, a massive ranch outside the city, and a private plane he only mentioned in passing. I asked him once what he loved most about his success, and he just said, "Time. I get to spend my days how I want, with my family and on my terms." That's when I realized the true value of wealth. Story 11. The wealthiest person I've ever met was a construction company owner named John. He wasn't flashy, just a guy in his mid-50s who spent most of his days in jeans and work boots, often on site at one of his projects. But what set John apart wasn't just his net worth. It was how he managed to build a life where money worked for him. He started small, learning every trade he could: plumbing, electrical, roofing, and eventually opened his own company. Over time, he got into commercial construction and started taking on bigger projects. But here's the kicker. John was a silent investor in many of the buildings he worked on. He'd negotiate deals where he'd build the property at cost in exchange for partial ownership. Over the years, that turned into a massive portfolio of office buildings, retail spaces, and even a few apartment complexes. When I asked him why he kept working when he could retire, he just laughed and said, "I like the game, not the money." But you could tell he enjoyed the perks: a sprawling house on a private lake, hunting trips across the country, and a vintage car collection he rarely showed off. Story 12. The richest guy I've ever met told me he was a farmer. Fair enough until I visited his farm and saw that it included a castle, a private lake, and a driveway longer than my daily step count. When I asked him what kind of crops he grew, he laughed and said, "Mostly money." Turns out, he rented out his land to other farmers and cashed in on fancy weddings at his estate. He still walked around in overalls and boots, though, because, as he put it, nobody argues with a man holding a pitchfork. Story 13. I once met a guy who got rich manufacturing cardboard boxes. Yep, just boxes. He didn't start out trying to build an empire. He just hated his job at a factory and thought, I could do this better. And he did. Now he's a billionaire, but you'd never know it because he insists on being the least impressive rich person alive. His office is in a warehouse, his lunch is usually a PB&J, and his car is a minivan with one hubcap missing. He said he tried driving a Tesla once but felt too conspicuous. Story 14. In college I had a professor who taught economics, but he lived like a real estate tycoon. Dr. Peterson had this way of blending academic theory with real-world hustle. One day during office hours I asked him why he drove an old beater car when everyone knew he was rich. He chuckled and said, "Because I invest in things that pay me back, not things that take my money." Turns out, he started buying properties during grad school, using his summer teaching income as a down payment on his first duplex. Over the next 20 years, he slowly built up a portfolio of rental properties, each carefully chosen near colleges and urban centers where tenants were never in short supply. He still taught because he loved it, but he didn't need the paycheck. What really blew my mind was how low-key he was about it all. His wealth wasn't flashy, it was quiet and purposeful. When I graduated, he gave me one piece of advice I'll never forget. Focus on building streams of income, not collecting toys. Toys get old, income doesn't. Story 15. The richest guy I know is a contractor named Mike. He's been building stuff for decades. Houses, office buildings, you name it. But here's the twist. He kept ownership stakes in half the projects he worked on. Now he owns so much property that he probably has to remind himself what he doesn't own. When I asked him why he still drives a beat-up truck, he said, "Because a fancy car won't haul lumber." His idea of luxury is a fishing trip, which he once described as a better ROI than any yacht. Story 16. The wealthiest guy I've ever known wasn't someone you'd spot in a suit or driving a flashy car. His name was Roy, and he owned parking lots. Just parking lots. I first met him when I worked part-time downtown during college. He'd occasionally show up to check on things, dressed in jeans and a faded ball cap, looking more like a retired truck driver than someone who practically owned half the city's asphalt. It wasn't until years later, when I ran into him at a neighborhood event, that I really learned his story. Roy had started in the 80s with a small, run-down lot on the edge of downtown. It was cheap because no one thought much of the area back then. He fixed it up just enough. Added some lights, slapped some paint on the lines, and bought a rickety old booth where an attendant could sit. At first, he worked the lot himself, charging just a couple of bucks per car. On weekends it was packed, mostly with people heading to bars or events downtown. The money came quickly, and he reinvested every dime into buying more lots. He didn't buy the fancy ones. He bought the forgotten ones, the spaces no one saw value in yet. Over time, the city expanded, and suddenly those lots became prime real estate. But Roy never sold them. "Why sell the cow when the milk's still good?" he'd joke. Eventually, he got automated payment systems and cut his costs even further. The only people he employed were attendants who rarely did anything but scroll through their phones. One time, I asked if the taxes on those lots were crushing, and he just nodded. "Oh yeah, taxes are murder," he said, "but you just have to play the long game. When the city gets too pricey, you go vertical, or you wait for a developer to give you an offer you can't refuse." He had offers all the time, apparently, millions for just one of his properties, but Roy wasn't in any hurry to sell. Despite his success, Roy never changed. He lived in the same modest house he'd owned since the 70s, drove an old pickup, and wore thrift store clothes. When someone asked him why he didn't upgrade his life, he shrugged and said, "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. My bank account's doing the talking." But what stuck with me most was something he told me at that neighborhood event. People think wealth is about living large. It's not. It's about freedom. I don't have to answer to anyone, and that's worth more than a mansion or a fancy car. The last I heard, Roy was semi-retired, still owning dozens of lots and spending his time traveling in an RV with his wife. He may not have looked rich, but he was the smartest business person I've ever met. Story 17. Back in the early 2000s, my dad's buddy Ed won $45 million in the lottery. Now, you'd think he'd go wild with that kind of money, but Ed was the definition of restraint. He immediately hired financial advisors, set up trusts for his kids, and started buying properties across the state. But here's the thing. Ed was no saint. He once admitted to my dad that he loved playing mind games with people who assumed he was broke. He still wore the same cheap jeans and drove his old Ford truck, even though he had the cash to buy half the town. When people tried to sell him luxury stuff, he'd laugh and walk away. The guy just didn't care about appearances. What he did care about was control. By the time he was 50, he was pulling in millions in passive income from his investments and rental properties. The last time I saw him, he joked about how people always asked him why he never quit his day job. His answer? Because I don't work for money. I work for fun. Story 18. Our old mailman, Doug, wasn't just delivering letters. He was delivering himself to the top of the property ladder. He started buying homes back in the 70s, using his mailman salary to grab cheap properties near his route. By the time he retired, he owned 20 houses, all paid off, and was making more in rent than he ever did delivering mail. When I asked why he didn't just quit his job earlier, he said, "Because I'm not dumb enough to walk away from a pension. Free money, kid. Always take the free money." Story 19. My sister is the richest person I know. She's been a software engineer for almost 15 years, working for some of the biggest names in tech. Think Silicon Valley heavyweights. She's not flashy, though. She lives in a modest house, drives a hybrid, and her idea of splurging is buying a fancy blender. But she's sitting on millions. It's not just her salary, it's her stock options. Over the years, those options have skyrocketed, and she used the windfall to invest in real estate. Now she owns properties in 3 states, renting them out for steady income. What's crazy is that she doesn't act like someone who's rich. She still clips coupons and shops at thrift stores, and most of her friends don't even know she's wealthy. When I asked her why she lives so modestly, she told me, "Wealth isn't about spending money. It's about not having to worry about money." That's when I realized how much of her life was built on purpose, not just chasing a paycheck, but creating a safety net so she could live on her own terms. Story 20. A buddy of mine introduced me to his rich friend once, and this guy had a knack for spotting ugly properties. He'd buy rundown apartments, slap on a fresh coat of paint, and cram in as many tenants as legally possible. I asked him if he ever felt bad about it, and he said, "Not at all. They're clean, they're affordable, and they work. Ugly makes money." His favorite story was about a place in Oslo where he turned a 1-bedroom into a 4-bedroom. I didn't even want to ask how. Story 21. The wealthiest person I've ever known was an old family friend, Mr. Parker. To anyone who didn't know him, he was just a farmer, a guy who spent his mornings feeding cattle and his afternoons fixing fences on his sprawling estate. But the truth was, Mr. Parker wasn't just any farmer. He inherited a massive plot of land that his family had owned for generations, and over the years, he'd turned it into a money-making machine. He leased parts of his property to big agricultural companies, sold off chunks to developers for millions, and even rented out barns for weddings. Yet he never acted rich. He drove an old pickup, wore faded overalls, and spent most of his time with his cows. One day I asked him why he didn't sell the farm and retire to a mansion somewhere warm. He laughed and said, "What would I do with all that money? My cows keep me grounded and my land keeps me happy." It hit me then. His wealth wasn't just in his bank account, It was in the way he chose to live. Story 22. When I was a kid, my family's mailman, Dave, was a bit of a local legend. Everyone liked him. He knew everyone's name, asked about their kids, and always had a cheerful howdy for anyone he passed. He worked the same route for decades, and people used to joke that he'd retire on the job because he seemed to love it so much. What we didn't know was that Dave wasn't just delivering mail. He was quietly building an empire. The story goes that back in the early 70s, Dave had a regular delivery stop at a golf course. He got to know some of the retired golfers, many of whom were wealthy businessmen. One day they gave him a piece of advice. Buy real estate. You don't have to be rich to get started. Just buy one property and let it grow. Dave took that advice to heart. He started small, buying a duplex near his mail route with a loan from his credit union. He rented out one side and lived in the other, scraping together every penny he could to pay it off quickly. Once he had equity in that property, he bought another, a small, single-family home, then another. By the time I was old enough to understand, Dave owned 15 or so rental properties, all in the same general area. He fixed them up himself on weekends, doing everything from plumbing to painting. He never splurged on anything. His car was a 20-year-old sedan, and his idea of a luxury purchase was a used fishing boat he got at a bargain price. I remember asking him once why he didn't retire early, considering he was making more from his rentals than he ever did delivering mail. He laughed and said, "Why give up the pension? It's free money if you can stick it out." He worked until he hit the official retirement age and collected his pension, adding another layer of financial security to his already impressive portfolio. The last time I saw Dave was just before he retired. He was carrying a newspaper with the classified section circled, looking for mountain properties where he planned to build his dream retirement home. He told me he was finally ready to slow down, though I doubted he ever would. Dave didn't just build wealth, he built a life where he could enjoy it on his own terms.